Okay, so, we're always trying to figure out who's really running the show, right? Like who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. You look at governments, big corporations, all those names in the headlines.
Yeah, yeah.
But what if I told you that real power, like the real power, operates in a way that's way more hidden, like structures that you won't find on any org chart?
Right.
Today, we're going to take a deep dive into this super interesting material that suggests there's like this hidden architecture of global influence.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It's called the star and circle model, and for you listening, especially if you love getting a handle on complex stuff quickly, this deep dive could give you a totally new way to see like how the world actually works.
So are you saying there's like a secret society controlling everything? Because I've heard that before.
Well, it's not quite that straightforward, but it is about power structures that operate outside the usual systems of accountability.
Okay, so less tinfoil hat, more like a deeper analysis of how power functions then.
Exactly. The star and circle model isn't just some random theory. It's presented as an analysis of how power might have been structured for like centuries. We're talking maybe even 3,000 years.
3,000 years, that's a long time.
I know, right? And it operates through these interconnected groups, kind of like roundtable groups that are like super insulated from the stuff that usually keeps power in check.
Like elections and laws and public scrutiny.
Yep, all that. So for anyone who's trying to understand like how decisions are made and who's making them, this suggests that we need to look way beyond what's obvious.
I'm starting to see why you called this a deep dive. This sounds complicated.
It is, but that's why we're here to break it down. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of this star and circle. First up, the circle. Think of it as the ultimate security system for this whole network, like the way it protects itself.
So we're talking about secrecy, I'm guessing?
Oh, absolutely. But it goes way beyond that. You've also got coercion, blackmail, ensuring total loyalty, like making sure no one spills the beans.
Yeah, like a kind of enforcement mechanism, making sure everyone stays in line.
Right. It's that shield that keeps the outside world from seeing what's really going on.
So the circle is the protection. Got it. What about the star part? What's that all about?
So the star is where the action is. It's everything that happens inside the circle. The networking, the deal making.
Like the inner workings of the machine?
Precisely. Think about like hidden agreements, how they settle their own disputes without going to court, how they come up with policies that like later get implemented on a larger scale.
Okay, so it's like a strategy room where the real decisions get made. Interesting.
Yeah, and here's where it gets even more mind-blowing. You see, the material we're looking at says it's not just about these separate groups, right?
Like they're not just operating in isolation.
Nope. The same people often belong to multiple organizations within this whole framework. So they're all interconnected, forming alliances, creating this like massive web of power.
Oh, wow. So it's not a simple pyramid structure.
It's more like a constellation where all the stars are connected. Or maybe like this thing called the Sephiroth, which is like a map of interconnected energies.
That's a good way to put it. Makes it harder to track than a simple chain of command, that's for sure.
Exactly. It makes it really hard to figure out who's responsible for what. Like understanding one event might mean seeing how it's connected to this much larger hidden picture.
So it's more than just identifying the bad guys. It's about understanding how their actions are all connected on a deeper level.
Right. You got to think about how all the pieces fit together.
It makes you wonder if maybe we miss the bigger picture sometimes, just focusing on the surface events.
Totally. It's like that saying, can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, when you're talking about hidden power, you got to talk about symbols, right?
Right, those secret handshakes and all that.
Well, not exactly handshakes, but symbols are definitely a thing. Ruling classes have been using them for like forever to identify each other and communicate in a way that most people wouldn't understand.
Makes sense. Like a secret language.
Right. And the article even quotes this guy, Albert Pike. He was a big deal in the Freemasons, who said symbols are like the universal language of ancient theology.
So maybe there's more to these symbols than we realize.
That's the point. The article suggests that the star and circle itself might not just be a concept, but a real organizational structure. And those symbols we see everywhere.
Like what?
Like secret society emblems, corporate logos, even national symbols.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
They might be clues pointing to where the real power lies. So it pays to be a little more observant.
Yeah, look for those patterns, connect the dots.
Exactly. And if you're wondering where this whole system might have originated, the article traces it back to a group that might surprise you.
Who? The Illuminati.
Nope, even earlier. The Jesuits.
The Jesuits, really? They seem pretty straightforward with their schools and all.
That's part of what's so interesting. The article argues that the Society of Jesus, which started way back in 1540, was like an early prototype for a global intelligence network.
I never thought about it that way. How would that even work?
Well, think about their position, right? They were in royal courts, universities, diplomatic missions. They were spies, advisors, educators, all at the same time.
Oh, I see. Like they had access to all sorts of information and could influence people in high places.
And they did it within this super structured and secretive organization.
So sneaky. Makes you wonder if they're still pulling strings today.
That's a whole other conversation. But for now, let's focus on how their organizational structure was different.
Yeah.
It wasn't a typical hierarchy. It was more like an interconnected web.
What do you mean?
Well, imagine a Jesuit priest. He could be confessing to a king, tutoring a prince, advising a foreign government, all while secretly reporting back to the Jesuit order.
Wow, that's multitasking on another level. So they were gathering intel and exerting influence all over the place.
Exactly. It's a really clever way to spread influence without anyone realizing it. Makes you think twice about who's really in charge, doesn't it?
For sure. It's like that saying, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer.
Exactly. And the article digs into some key aspects of their approach that later organizations seem to have borrowed. First, total obedience to the superior general. He's like the head honcho, sometimes called the Black Pope because of, like, immense but hidden power.
Black Pope, that sounds ominous.
Right. This ensured everyone was loyal and followed the same agenda. Like, you can't have a secret society if everyone's going rogue.
Yeah, that makes sense. You need strong leadership to keep everyone focused.
Then there's this thing called the Jesuit Oath of Induction. It's a bit controversial, but it supposedly outlines a commitment to deception, infiltration, and basically doing whatever it takes to achieve the order's goals.
Wow, that's hardcore. Not exactly the image I had of the Jesuits.
Right. It highlights the potential for ruthlessness in these types of organizations. You know, sometimes the ends justify the means.
But how do they keep all this secret? I mean, with so many people involved, someone's bound to talk.
Well, that's where the next tactic comes in. Compartmentalization of information. Basically, members only knew what they needed to know for their specific tasks.
So kind of like the need-to-know basis.
Exactly. It kept the bigger picture hidden, so even if someone spilled the beans, they wouldn't know enough to bring down the whole operation.
Clever. It's like a puzzle where no one has all the pieces.
And speaking of clever, they also had this long-term strategy with education. They gained control of a bunch of prestigious universities across Europe so they could basically shape the thinking of future leaders, politicians, generals, bankers.
Oh, wow. So they were playing the long game, influencing the people who would eventually be in charge. Talk about thinking ahead.
Right. It's all about planting those seeds early on. And then there's their role as confessors and advisors to rulers. That gave them access to state secrets and a way to nudge policy in the direction they wanted.
It's like ruling from behind the throne. Very subtle, very effective.
And apparently, this Jesuit model didn't just disappear. The article claims that other groups copied or were directly inspired by their system.
Like who?
Well, there's Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati, which apparently had a similar structure, but with the goal of secular global control. And then there's Cecil Rhodes and his Round Table, which was all about expanding the British Empire using the Jesuit playbook.
So the Jesuits were like the OGs of this whole hidden power thing. That's fascinating. Makes you wonder if their influence is still felt today.
Right. Like, did their tactics just get passed down through the generations?
Exactly. I mean, the article even suggests that modern intelligence agencies might have inherited some of their principles.
Oh, for sure. Think about the CIA, MI6, Mossad. Secrecy, deception, psychological warfare, all techniques the Jesuits were known for. It's like those tactics were adapted and refined over time.
So it's not just about historical curiosity. This stuff is still relevant today.
Absolutely. So we've got this Jesuit model of covert influence. They were operating in the shadows, controlling education, infiltrating other power structures, manipulating information. And this model, this star and circle idea, well, it seems to have evolved in some pretty big ways.
So where did it go from there? Who else adopted this model?
Well, that's where it gets even more intriguing.
Yeah.
The article claims that intelligence agencies and, get this, organized crime syndicates took this Jesuit model and really perfected it.
Wait, the mob and the CIA are using the same playbook?
That's the argument.
Yeah.
They both operate outside the usual laws and systems, right? They have their own internal rules, their own ways of enforcing loyalty and keeping secrets.
I guess that makes sense. They both need to operate under the radar.
Right. The article says that while the Jesuits might have relied on ideological obedience, intelligence agencies and crime groups have their own languages of enforcement.
Meaning?
Well, for the mob, it's violence and threats. For spy agencies, it's secret laws and, well, let's just say persuasion tactics.
Okay, so different methods, but same goal. Control.
Exactly. But the basic principles of the star and circle secrecy, internal justice, loyalty, those stay the same.
So even though they seem like completely different worlds, they might be operating on a similar framework. That's pretty wild.
Right. And the article highlights a bunch of parallels. For example, think about Omerta, the mafia's code of silence. It's basically the same thing as the secrecy in other organizations. Or initiation through blood oaths in crime families, which is similar to the rituals and oaths in groups like the Jesuits and Freemasons.
Oh, yeah, you hear about those secret oaths all the time, but I never thought about how they might serve a similar purpose across different groups.
Right. And even the way crime families pass down power through generations echoes how elite political and financial networks stay in control. It's all about keeping it in the family, so to speak.
So it's not just about structures and tactics, it's also about maintaining control over time, passing the torch to the next generation.
Exactly. And the article also points out that criminal organizations even have their own courts to settle disputes internally, just like these roundtable groups might do. They don't need the official legal system. They handle things their own way.
That makes sense. They can't exactly go to the police to settle their differences.
Right. And then you've got a blackmail and coercion, which intelligence agencies use to get people to do what they want. The article compares this to the way the Jesuits might have indoctrinated and controlled their members.
So it's all about leverage, whether it's through ideology or something more concrete like blackmail material.
It's about having something over someone, something that keeps them in line.
And the article mentions state-sanctioned criminal enterprises. That sounds pretty heavy.
Yeah, it dives into stuff like the CIA's alleged ties to drug cartels, which is a whole rabbit hole we could go down another time.
Yeah, maybe save that one for later.
But it gets at this idea that the line between official and unofficial power can be blurry, you know. And intelligence agencies have these specialized techniques, like controlled opposition and narrative control. They can even manage threats by making them part of the system.
That's kind of mind-bending, the idea that even the opposition might be controlled to some extent. It makes you question everything.
Right. And we can't forget about the money. The Jesuits were known for controlling a lot of wealth through the Vatican. The article compares that to modern elites using offshore banking to hide their money. It even gets into corporate racketeering and those economic hitmen who use financial pressure to get countries to do what they want.
So it's like this whole shadow financial system that operates alongside the official one.
Exactly. And the star and circle model, the way it's set up with the circle for protection and the star for internal networking, allows these groups to work together without anyone noticing.
It's like a well-oiled machine, but hidden from view.
And that brings us to another key concept, Fabian permeation. It's also called the Judas effect. Sounds pretty intense, right?
Yeah, a little bit. What is it exactly?
Well, it's basically a counterintelligence strategy. It's how the people in power protect themselves from threats. But instead of fighting directly, they infiltrate the opposition and try to control it from within.
Oh, wow. So they're playing the long game, undermining their opponents from the inside.
Exactly. The Fabian Society, which was founded in 1884, is where the name comes from. They believed in gradual change rather than revolution.
So instead of trying to crush the opposition, they co-opt it. That's sneaky.
And it can take many forms. The article talks about how revolutions might actually be started, or at least guided by the very elites they're supposed to overthrow. And opposition leaders often come from the same institutions they claim to be challenging.
It's like a game of chess, where your opponent is already a few moves ahead.
Right. And even investigative journalists and whistleblowers might be operating within certain limits, only revealing what those in power are willing to let out. So you have to wonder who's really controlling the information we get.
That's a good question. It makes you think twice about who to trust.
Right. And this Fabian permeation is designed to keep the star and circle model safe, even if some people get exposed or fall from grace. The whole system is built to absorb those shocks.
So it's like a self-healing system. No matter what happens, it adapts and survives. Pretty resilient.
Which is why it's so important to understand how it works. And speaking of understanding, the article also delves into psychological and epistemological warfare. This is how the star and circle model manipulates how we think and what we believe.
So it's not just about controlling information, it's about controlling how we process that information. That's even more insidious.
Right. They want to shape our very perception of reality. The article outlines three main ways they do this. First, perception management. This is all about controlling the narrative.
So like propaganda.
Kinda, but more sophisticated. Think about who owns the media, who decides what stories get told, how they use techniques like gaslighting to make people doubt their own sanity. They can even manufacture crises to justify more control.
Like a false flag operation.
Could be. And then there's predictive programming, where they introduce ideas in movies and books years in advance, so when those things happen in real life, people are already primed to accept them.
Oh, wow. It's like they're planting seeds in our subconscious.
Exactly. And they create these double-bind narratives,
Huh.
where both options ultimately lead to the same outcome, reinforcing their power. It's really sneaky.
So it's about limiting our choices even when we think we have free will.
It's about controlling the whole game board. And then there's epistemological warfare, which is even trickier. This is about messing with how we know what we know, attacking the very foundations of our beliefs.
How do they do that?
Well, the article talks about logical fallacies like if and because, which they use to shut down critical thinking.
So they're using flawed logic to make their arguments seem sound.
Exactly. And they weaponize guilt and social pressure to make people feel like it's immoral to question the narrative.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that. Like, if you don't agree, you're a bad person.
And then there's the language they use, calling anyone who questions things a conspiracy theorist to instantly discredit them.
Yeah.
And they control funding for research and education to make sure only certain ideas are considered valid.
So they're controlling what we learn, what we think about, even how we think. That's scary.
Right. It's not just about keeping information secret. It's about making people resistant to even considering alternative viewpoints.
It's like building a mental wall to keep out any ideas that might threaten their control.
And that's not all. There's also controlled opposition, which we touched on with the Fabian Society.
Yeah.
This involves putting their own people in charge of opposition groups, dividing and conquering dissenting voices, and making sure any reforms are just cosmetic, not really changing anything.
So it's like creating the illusion of change while maintaining the status quo. Very deceptive.
Right. They want you to think you have a choice, but really you're just picking between different flavors of the same thing.
And this all ties back to that Fabian permeation idea, right?
Yeah.
Subtly influencing the opposition to prevent any real threat.
Exactly. They're playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. And then there's this even weirder concept called revelation of the method. It's like sometimes they just tell you what they're doing right out in the open.
Why would they do that?
Well, the article suggests that they're banking on the public being too apathetic or just not getting it.
Yeah.
It's like they're mocking us, saying, look what we're doing. What are you going to do about it?
That's pretty arrogant, but I guess if it works, why not?
Right. And they use all sorts of techniques for this. There's symbolic communication, where they hide messages in plain sight. They might leak information through fiction or controlled whistleblowers. And they keep us in a state of constant crisis, so we're always distracted and stressed out.
It's like they're saying, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. They're counting on us being too overwhelmed to fight back. So we've gone from historical examples to psychological manipulation. But this story isn't over yet. The article says that in the digital age, the star and circle model is getting a serious upgrade.
So the internet and all that is just another tool for them to use.
More than a tool, it's like a whole new playing field. They're using algorithms, surveillance, and AI to control us in ways that were never possible before.
That's pretty unsettling. Makes you wonder if there's any escape.
Well, we'll get to that. But first, let's break down how this digital upgrade is happening. The article points to things like central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. It's like programmable money. They can be tracked and controlled in ways that regular cash can't.
Oh, wow. So they could literally turn off your money if they wanted to.
It's possible. And then there are social credit systems, like they have in China, where your behavior is constantly monitored and scored, and AI-powered policing that can predict crimes before they happen. It's like something out of Minority Report.
Yeah, I've seen that movie. Not exactly a future I want to live in.
Right. And it's not just about punishment. They can use all this data to manipulate our behavior, nudge us in certain directions without us even realizing it.
It's like they're programming society itself.
And with deepfakes and synthetic media, they can create realities that aren't even real. It's becoming harder and harder to know what's true.
So truth itself becomes a battleground.
Exactly. The whole game has shifted from keeping secrets to controlling what we see and believe. And AI is a huge part of this. It can analyze massive amounts of data to predict our behavior, create propaganda that's tailored to our individual beliefs, and nudge us in the direction they want.
It's like having a digital puppet master.
Right. It's a really powerful system of control. But the article does offer some hope. It says that even this digital oligarchy has weaknesses.
Okay, good, because this is all starting to sound pretty hopeless. What are these weaknesses?
Well, first of all, it all depends on mass compliance. If enough people refuse to use CBDCs or participate in social credit systems, the whole thing falls apart.
So our power lies in our choices.
Exactly. And even though algorithms are powerful, they can be unpredictable. Unexpected events or widespread non-compliance can throw a wrench in the works.
So the system isn't foolproof. There are cracks they can't control.
Right. And most importantly, the article emphasizes the power of human resistance, what it calls an epistemological awakening.
What does that mean?
It's about reclaiming our ability to think for ourselves, to question the narrative, to use our reason and intuition, to see through the lies.
So basically, don't believe everything you're told. Think critically.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
The author, Peter Duke, defines this as logos, with a hard O, based on this ancient Greek definition. Thinking, measuring, reasoning, and communicating.
So logos as in logic and critical thinking, not the biblical word.
Exactly. It's about using our minds to break free from the mental programming.
So how do we do that? How do we fight back against this system of control?
Well, the article suggests a few things. First, be aware of the tactics they're using. Once you know how the game is played, it's harder to be manipulated.
Knowledge is power. Got it.
And be skeptical. Don't just believe everything you hear or see. Do your own research, question the official narrative, and be open to alternative viewpoints.
So don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Think for yourself.
Exactly. And the article proposes this idea of phantom cells, which are basically small groups of people who are committed to truth and critical thinking.
So like little pockets of resistance.
Right. They can share information, support each other, and be more resilient because they're not centralized.
Kind of like a decentralized network. That's smart.
And the article also gets into this idea of Jesus as Logos incarnate. But it's not talking about the religious interpretation. It's about understanding Jesus as representing this concept of reason and truth.
That's an interesting interpretation. So how does that tie into fighting back against this control system?
Well, the article suggests that Jesus, in this context, represents the way to overcome deception and achieve true freedom. It also highlights a passage in the Bible where it says that even 2 or 3 people gathered together can access truth. The idea is that we don't need large institutions to find truth. We can do it ourselves through critical thinking and open communication.
So it's about empowering ourselves, reclaiming our own ability to discern truth from falsehood.
Exactly. The key takeaway here is that we need to revive, practice, and teach this concept of Loftus critical thinking, reasoning, and truthful communication. That's how we dismantle this whole hidden control structure.
So it's not just about fighting the system. It's about building something better, something based on truth and individual empowerment.
Right on. And the article goes back to real-world examples to show how the star and circle model protects itself. It looks at the JFK assassination and the Epstein scandal as case studies.
Okay, so how do those events fit into this whole model?
Well, both cases involve a visible crime, right? But then the official narrative gets shaped really quickly, evidence disappears, and the public is bombarded with conflicting information.
So it's like a smokescreen to hide the truth. Classic disinformation tactics.
The article argues that the goal isn't to eliminate information entirely, but to create so much confusion that the truth becomes impossible to find. It's about making us doubt everything.
So it's not just about controlling what we know, it's about making us unsure of what we know. That's pretty effective.
Right. And the only way to counter this is through Logos, through that critical thinking and clear reasoning that we were talking about. When we see through the illusions, the power of this system starts to fade.
So it's like shining a light on the cockroaches that can't survive in the open?
And speaking of seeing things clearly, the article ends by pointing out how often the star and circle symbol appears in the real world.
Like where?
Everywhere. The U.S. Pentagon, the Russian Red Army, the EU flag, Freemason symbols, the CIA seal, the World Economic Forum logo, even corporate logos like Texaco and Starbucks.
Wow, that's a lot of examples. It can't just be a coincidence.
Exactly. The article suggests that this symbol might represent this hidden power structure we've been talking about.
So it's like a secret handshake, but a visual one, a way for those in the know to recognize each other.
Right. It's a subtle sign that this system of control is pervasive,
Hmm.
that it might be operating at levels we don't even realize.
That's a pretty sobering thought. It makes you wonder how much of the world is actually controlled by this hidden network.
So let's recap what we've learned in this deep dive. We started with this idea of a hidden power structure, the star and circle model. We looked at its historical roots, possibly going back to the Jesuits, and how it's been adopted by all sorts of groups, from intelligence agencies to organized crime.
And we talked about the tactics they use: Fabian permeation, psychological warfare, digital surveillance.
Right. But we also talked about the weaknesses of this system, especially its dependence on compliance and the power of human reason, that locus thing.
Which is really the key takeaway here, right? That we're not powerless. We can fight back by thinking critically, questioning everything, and reclaiming our ability to discern truth from falsehood.
Exactly. It all starts with awareness. Once you know the game, you can start to play it differently. So as you go about your day, keep an eye out for that star and circle symbol. It might be more than just a design.
And don't let anyone tell you what to think. Use your own mind, your own reason, your own intuition. That's the best defense against manipulation.
This deep dive is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn. But the most important thing is to keep asking questions, keep seeking truth, and never stop thinking for yourself.
Because in the end, the truth will set you free.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.